The stone walls of the holding pen reeked of fierce sweat and burning sage. Airless could smell the char in the air. They'd already executed 3 villages' worth of accused witches, mostly just unlucky women who knew too much about herbs or too little about keeping quiet, and the kingdom's appetite for cleansing hadn't slowed. She stood in the darkness with her 9 sisters, calculating dosages while her hands trembled. The love potion was a last resort. Worse than a last resort, it was desperation stitched into ingredient measurements she barely trusted. Nightshade petals, 1. Honey from a virgin hive, impossible to verify, and she had questions about who was checking. The tears of someone who'd forgiven a betrayal. She'd used her own, which was cheating. And the blood of the drinker's intended beloved. She didn't have the drinker's blood. She didn't have the beloved's blood. What she did have was a headache. A recipe written by someone who'd clearly never had to source ingredients under prison conditions, and the growing suspicion that the entire field of love magic had been invented by optimists. She had rumors that Alpha King Alaric was moving through the kingdom on a circuit of dominance displays, and she had a wine merchant's careless comment that the royal contingent would stop at the fortress that held them. The potion would fail. Some part of her knew it the moment she mixed it, the way you know a loaf won't rise when the starter's gone flat. But if it didn't fail, if by some terrible miracle it worked, the Alpha King would see magic as a tool he could use, and he would free her coven. Or he would execute them faster. Either way, something would happen, which was more than she could say about her current strategy of sitting in a stone room waiting to burn. Sabra gripped her shoulder, the older witch's palm hot against her neck. "Don't," Sabra whispered. "I can see you thinking about something stupid." Airless didn't answer. She corked the vial and wrapped it in cloth. The wine merchant's visit was tomorrow. She had a kitchen boy named Davi who owed her for the boil she'd lanced on his neck 3 weeks ago, and who was responsible for receiving the merchant's deliveries. She had a chance that was less than a chance, and she had 9 sisters who would burn in 4 days when the full moon came. She was going to take it. It was, she reflected, the most elaborately terrible plan she'd ever conceived, and she'd once tried to cure a goat's anxiety with chamomile and prayer. The feast hall smelled of roasted meat and wood smoke. Earlies had been brought up by a senior guard with a hand that was somehow both rough and apologetic, positioned near the kitchen entrance, where she could watch the high table without appearing to. The kitchen boy had done his part that morning, slipped the vial into the wine case marked for the high table, while the merchant was arguing about payment for the last delivery. She'd watched from behind a flour barrel, which was not the dignified position she'd imagined for herself when she'd decided to seduce a king. In her defense, she hadn't imagined any of this. The plan had been conceived in a cell that smelled like fear and sage, and it had the structural integrity of a plan conceived in a cell that smelled like fear and sage. The Alpha King held court like a man who had never encountered a person who might say no to him. He was younger than she expected, early 30s maybe, with the kind of stillness that made the room orbit around him without his seeming to notice. His hands were scarred from transformations. His eyes were the gray-silver of a wolf's, which meant the animal in him was close enough to the surface that some part of it was always looking out. He wore black leather, nothing ornamental. A king who didn't need to perform. His general sat to his right, an older man with the kind of bone-deep loyalty that came from surviving too many wars together. To his left, 3 alpha wolves in human form, built like the architecture of violence. One of them had a neck wider than Airless's entire future. The wine merchant presented a new vintage. Airless watched as servants poured, watched Alaric lift his cup without attention to it, his focus on the general's report about a village dispute. She had gambled everything on a man who wasn't even looking at his drink. This was the moment, the culmination of all her desperate planning, the make-or-break instant on which 9 lives depended. Alaric drank. And nothing happened. He continued his conversation. The general made a point about grazing rights. An alpha laughed, a sound like gravel in a bucket. Airless felt the potion's failure like a stone in her chest. She had gambled her coven on a formula that didn't work, from a craft that was dying because they were running out of women and time. She was going to burn because she'd trusted a recipe that called for virgin bee honey, as though anyone had ever successfully interviewed a bee about its personal life. In retrospect, she thought, the recipe's author had probably died of something unrelated to competence, and there was a lesson in that. "You're very tense." The voice came from directly beside her. She turned and found Alaric standing there, the silver eyes full of sharp amusement. He'd crossed an entire feast hall without her noticing, which was either impressive or terrifying, or both. "Tell me you poisoned the wine." Her mouth went dry. "Better." He smiled, not a kind expression. "You poisoned the wine with love magic, a potion, which didn't work." He lifted a scarred hand, spread the fingers. "I can smell magic the way other men smell smoke, and I smelled yours the moment you walked in the room. Now you're vibrating with panic because it didn't do anything." He waited. She didn't speak. She was too busy experiencing the specific sensation of a small animal realizing the shadow overhead has talons. "Your coven is imprisoned in the Western Tower," he continued, still casual, still amused. 9 witches. You're scheduled for execution at the full moon in 4 days. The order came from the throne, mine technically, though I think you'll find I signed it about 6 weeks ago, when my advisors were very insistent about this magical threat business. He tilted his head. "You're the last of them, aren't you? The one they think is the coven's leader?" Airless heard her own heartbeat in her ears. Also, distantly, the sound of her entire plan crumbling into fine powder. "Here's what's going to happen," Alaric said. And now there was nothing amused in his expression, only the flat certainty of a man who had spent his life doing exactly what he said he would do. "You're going to leave this feast and return to your cell. Tomorrow, I'm going to have you brought to my chambers, and you're going to tell me everything about the 9 witches, their magic, their knowledge, their loyalty. In exchange, I'm going to tell the court that your potion worked, that you seduced the great Alpha King with a love charm." "It didn't work." "No," he agreed, "but I'm going to claim it did, which means you're going to have to play the role of the woman who bewitched me. You're going to stand beside my throne. You're going to present as my beloved, my chosen, the witch who managed what no human woman has. And in 4 days, when the full moon comes, the court will see me too devoted to my enchantress to burn her sisters. In fact, the magic will be too valuable to destroy." He leaned closer. The wolf in him smelled like copper and pines. "You tried to love potion the one thing in this kingdom that cannot be magicked. Congratulations. You just saved your own life by failing completely." The guards took her away before she could respond, which was fine, because her planned response had been a sort of strangled noise, and she didn't think it would have helped. As they escorted her down the corridor, she had the uncharitable thought that if she survived this, she was going to write a very strongly worded letter to whoever had authored that potion recipe. "Dear Madam, your formula is garbage. The bee honey specification in particular suggests a troubling lack of familiarity with actual bees." The lie to the coven came the next morning. Airlys was brought to the holding cell with a guard who stayed by the door, close enough to hear every word. She had the night to plan her face, and it wasn't enough. Sabra saw her first, the older witch's body coiling with recognition that something had shifted. The other sisters turned toward her like flowers tracking sun. They hadn't slept. Airless could see that in the hollows under their eyes, in the way Marin's hands shook as she reached out. "It worked," Airless said. The silence that followed was the sound of 9 women learning they would live. Sabra's face changed, hope blooming across it like water finding cracks. Her hand went to her mouth. Airless had known Sabra for 20 years, had learned the healing arts from her, had trusted her with the ritual magic that defined their lives. Now she watched her oldest sister believe a lie, and the weight of it settled across her shoulders like wet stone. "The potion worked?" Marin moved closer, her sharp eyes fixed on Airless's face. Marin was clever, too clever. Trained in the old languages, the kind of witch who read between words and occasionally between the words between words. "Completely." Airlys forced herself to smile, not too wide, not with too much brightness. The smile of someone who had barely survived something and was surprised to be alive. "Yes." Marin stared at her for a long moment. Earlys could feel the younger witch testing the shape of the lie, the way you test a footbridge, carefully, ready to withdraw if it crumbled. "The king wants me to confirm the details," Earlys continued, layering more truth into it like camouflage. "That's why I'm here. To remind myself of exactly how the working was done, to make sure I can repeat it if he asks. The magic has to be consistent." It was a lie wrapped in logic. Marin's sharp eyes softened a degree. She was still watching, but the moment of testing had passed. "He claimed me publicly," Earlys said. And this was entirely true, and it helped her voice steady. "In front of the court, said the magic was remarkable, that he's never felt anything like it. He told the judges that executing the coven would be—" She found the word Alaric had used, the perfect mix of arrogance and affection. "Wasteful." Sabra made a sound like a caught breath. She pulled Airly into an embrace, and Airly let herself be held, let her sister believe her, let the lie sink into the space between them like oil on water. "Soon," she whispered into Sabra's shoulder. "He's going to release us. We'll have time. We'll have a chance." The words tasted like ash. She stood in the holding cell with her sisters for an hour, answering questions about Alaric, about the potion's effect, about whether he'd been cruel or kind. She gave them truths where she could. He was predatory, he was sharp, he had amused eyes, and he wore black leather in a way that suggested a man whose entire wardrobe strategy was simply never being wrong. She let them interpret it as a man bewitched. Sabra held her hand. Marin watched from the corner. The other 7 sisters filled the space with belief. When the guard finally took her away, Airlys felt the lie's weight settle into her bones, and she understood that she would be carrying it for the rest of her life. However long that turned out to be. The Alpha King's chambers were in the highest tower. The walls were stone, the furnishings minimal. A bed, a table, a chair beside a window that overlooked the entire kingdom in spread of valleys and forests. Alaric stood at that window, his back to her, one hand against the glass. He had the posture of a man who'd been looking at maps of his own problems and finding all of them unsatisfying. "You're a very good liar," he said without turning. "Your sister almost caught you, the sharp one." "Marin." "She loves you," still not looking at her. "The question now is whether that love will keep her quiet or whether she'll come to hate you when she realizes the truth. Some people love in a way that survives betrayal. Others don't." Airlys came to stand beside him, leaving space between them. From this vantage, she could see the fortress walls, the people moving in the courtyard. Guards, servants, merchants. None of them aware that their king had taken a witch into his private chambers to discuss the terms of a fake romance, which was not how she'd expected her week to go. Then again, her week had started in a cell, peaked at a flour barrel, and was apparently concluding with a business arrangement disguised as a love story. She was running out of ways to be surprised. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Everything. But let's start with the potion." He finally turned to face her. The silver eyes were closer to gray now. The wolf settled deeper. "What was it supposed to do?" "Make you love me. Make you devoted. Make you willing to burn your kingdom for my sake." And instead, it didn't work, obviously, although to be fair, the recipe was very confident. He smiled. "Because I can't be magicked. The wolf won't allow it. Magic looks like a predator to the animal part of me, and we kill predators." He moved away from the window, poured wine from a carafe on the table. Not the poisoned batch. "Your magic works on human systems, emotion, thought, will. The wolf operates on instinct, scent, truth that has nothing to do with words. You can't magic something that doesn't think in words." He offered her the wine. She didn't take it. "Smart," he said, amused. "Don't accept drinks from powerful men, especially when you've recently poisoned one. Continue." "Why did you claim the potion worked?" "Because I wanted to." He settled into the chair by the window. "Magic hasn't walked in my kingdom for 5 generations. The old treaties are dead. Your coven is the last living connection to the time before my kind ruled. and they were going to burn because my counsel convinced me they were a threat. He sipped the wine. It turned out I was bored enough to be interested in finding out if my counsel was actually wrong about something as obvious as witch burning. And am I a threat? I have absolutely no idea. He looked at her with full attention now, the kind of focus that made the room shrink. That's the interesting part. You tried to love potion an apex predator with a craft that doesn't work on his breed. You failed spectacularly and then lied about the failure to save people you loved. That's either the most dangerous kind of stupid or the most intelligent kind of courage, and I can't tell which yet. He stood and moved closer. Here's what happens now. You stay in the castle. You present as my beloved. You're watched constantly. The court will expect nothing less. You avoid magic, because if I find out you've been working spells in my fortress, I will execute your coven personally. And you tell me everything about the witch knowledge your people have kept, the healing arts, the old ways, all of it. In exchange, your sisters live, and you live, and possibly, if you're very lucky and very clever, you'll survive long enough to matter. Airless realized she was trembling. One more thing, Alaric continued. You tried to make me love you. That's not an outcome that's possible for me. I don't work that way. But I'm curious whether you'll find another way to make it happen, now that you understand the mechanism. His smile sharpened. Let's see what you're actually capable of. He gave her a chamber 2 doors from his own. It was nicer than anywhere she'd slept in her life, which was a low bar, given that her previous accommodation had been a stone cell with a bucket, but still. The bed had actual pillows. She sat on it and stared at the ceiling and thought, I have just entered a fake relationship with a wolf king who can smell lies. This will go well. The court was a cathedral of power. Earlys learned its rhythms over the first 2 weeks. Where Alaric sat when he wasn't on the throne, which advisors he listened to, few. Which he ignored completely, most. What made his fingers drum against the armrest? Inefficiency, incompetence, boredom, and once, a presentation about grain tariffs that lasted 40 minutes and made even the wolves look like they wanted to chew their own legs off. She also learned that Keth, the alpha who sat to Alaric's left, had a resting expression that suggested he was perpetually evaluating whether the nearest person was food, and that the court historian had a voice that could put a war council to sleep within 11 minutes, a fact she had personally timed. She learned to walk at his side. She learned to stand close enough to be claimed without being close enough to be comforted. Alaric touched her in public, a hand at her back, fingers brushing her wrist. Never warm, never suggesting affection, always calculated for the court's observation. She watched them interpret it as magic, as bewitchment, as the terrible power of a witch's devotion. They believed it because Alaric believed it, and Alaric had spent his life persuading people that whatever he said was exactly true. The man could have told the court the sky was green, and half of them would have started redecorating. She also learned the castle's architecture through the servants who attended her, a laundress named Petra who talked while she worked and had opinions about everyone, a records clerk named Fen who brought her candles and apparently couldn't stop himself from explaining how the administrative systems worked, the way some men couldn't stop themselves from explaining swords. Airless listened to everything, because a woman who might burn in the near future develops a strong interest in understanding exactly how the building around her operates. The old master of coin, a careful man named Torin, who'd served 3 kings before Alaric, watched her with poorly concealed suspicion. He didn't believe the enchantment narrative. She could see it in the way his eyes tracked her movement, in the tension that appeared whenever she spoke. He was old enough to remember when magic actually walked in the kingdom, before the treaties, before the hunts. He knew what love potions could and couldn't do, and his skepticism was starting to infect others. In the second week, a court session devolved into a discussion of taxation. Torin presented his proposal. The kingdom's resources were stretched thin from Alaric's recent military campaigns, and the castle itself was consuming more than usual. Extra guards, expanded stores, the mysterious new arrivals, he meant the witches, requiring food and housing. Earlish sat in her designated position, and watched Alaric handle it with the kind of elegant disinterest that made disagreement seem personally insulting. He listened to Torin's entire proposal, then said, "The magic is valuable enough to warrant the expense. The woman has already demonstrated knowledge of healing arts that would take our physicians decades to acquire. Her value compounds." "But, sire," Torin said carefully, "if the enchantment is natural, that is, if it's a temporary effect of the love magic—" "Then I'll have the knowledge regardless," Alaric interrupted. "And I'll have had the pleasure of her company while she was mine. Seems like a reasonable trade." The word temporary hung in the air. It was the first time anyone had dared to suggest that the love potion might wear off, that Alaric might eventually come to his senses. She saw Alaric register the challenge, saw the flat expression that replaced his courtesy. "Actually," Erlise heard herself say, "I've been thinking about how to maintain the potency of the initial working. Repeated doses would degrade the effect. Magic builds resistance the same way the body does. But there's a secondary working I could perform, a reinforcement, more subtle than the original, but permanent." The room went very quiet. Alaric turned to look at her. She could see him calculating whether she was lying, whether she was performing, whether the secondary working she was inventing on the spot was even theoretically possible. His expression said, "What are you doing?" Her expression, she hoped, said, "Saving your narrative, trust me." His expression said, "This had better work." Her expression said, "It will if you stop looking at me like that." "What would that require?" he asked. "Time," Erlise said. "Time and some specific herbs. Maybe 2 weeks of preparation. And something personal, something that carries your imprint that the spell can anchor to. A piece of clothing that you've worn." She was making it up as she spoke, but she was also drawing on real magic, on the actual principle that intention and connection could deepen over time, on the understanding that a potion wasn't a spell, but a spell could be woven into something more durable. Mostly she was drawing on the fact that she'd spent 20 years learning to sound confident while internally panicking, which was, she supposed, its own kind of magic. Torin's skepticism was noticeably weaker when she finished. After the court session ended, Alaric cornered her in a corridor. "Were you lying?" he asked. "Yes and no," Erlise said. "The secondary working isn't a real thing, but the principle is sound. Magic does anchor to intention and connection, and I do have herbs that could reinforce the narrative." "So you just invented a spell in front of the entire court?" "I just gave them what they needed to believe," she said. "That you're not coming out of the enchantment. That you're not going to wake up one morning and wonder what you were thinking." He studied her for a long moment. "You're very dangerous." "I'm trying to survive," Erlise said, "the same way you are." "I'm not surviving," he said. "I'm running a kingdom. There's a difference." "Is there? Because from where I'm standing, you're a man who made a decision his entire court thinks is insane, and now you're improvising reasons for it to have been strategic. That's survival with better furniture." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, at being read that accurately by someone who'd known him for 2 weeks. "Don't do that in public." "Do what?" "Be right about me where people can hear it." Later that afternoon, they were alone in the gardens. Alaric had a habit of walking the grounds in the hour before sunset, checking the fortress's perimeter, speaking to guards. Erlise had begun to accompany him without being asked. It was good for the narrative, the bewitched king unable to be parted from his enchantress. It was also, she was beginning to suspect, something neither of them wanted to interrupt. They walked in silence for a time, past the hedges and the carefully maintained flower beds. The wolfsbane was in bloom, purple flowers that looked innocent until you remembered what they could do to a wolf. Alaric ignored the plants with the careful indifference of someone who had made peace with being surrounded by things that wanted to hurt him. Erlise made a mental note to ask the gardener whose idea the wolfsbane had been, because someone in this castle had a very dark sense of humor. "Your friend in court," she said, watching the wall where guards patrolled. "The one who wasn't entirely human a moment ago." "Keth, one of my original alphas. He's testing you." "Testing what?" whether you're a real threat or just a convenient story. Alaric paused at a corner of the garden where the grass opened onto a view of the lower valleys. The pack has concerns about magic, about you, about whether I'm making a decision or falling into something that looks like a decision and feels like a choice. Are you? Erlis asked. I don't know yet. He said it without performance, without the flatness of court. This was his voice alone. That's what scares them. I don't know. I claimed you in front of the court because it was strategically valuable and because the wolf wanted to. Those are usually the same calculation. But right now they're not lining up the way they should, and the alphas can smell the discord. He looked at her directly. You should be afraid, of all of them, of me most of all. I'm terrified, Erlis said, but I'm more afraid of what happens if you execute my coven. So the terror of you is just a lower number than the other terror. I've been doing triage on my fears, and you came in third, after burning alive and Marin finding out I lied. Your sister is scarier than the Alpha King? You haven't seen her when she finds a filing error. Something shifted in his expression, not softness exactly, but a fracture in his perfect control. That's honest. Yes. Don't lose that, he said. Don't start performing the fear the way you performed the belief to your coven. I need to know what you actually think. They walked in silence for a while, and Erlis found herself thinking about what it meant to stand beside someone and have them ask you to stop lying. That was a kind of intimacy too, different from the marking, different from the mate bond, but no less binding. It required a different kind of vulnerability, not of the body, but of the mind. Of the self that lived underneath all the performance. The sun was beginning to set by the time they returned to the castle. The sky had turned from blue to gold to deep purple, and Alaric walked beside her with an ease that surprised her, like standing together in a garden at dusk was something they had done 1,000 times. Near the end of the third week, she discovered what he needed. She was in the library, alone, reading a text on herbal preservation, because it was the only thing she could do that didn't feel like a performance. The book was old, written in the careful hand of someone who'd lived 200 years ago, who'd known plants and seasons the way the current generation barely remembered. It was the kind of thing her coven had nearly lost to the burning, knowledge that was almost extinct. She was so focused on the page that she almost didn't hear the sound from the garden. The window looked out on the stone garden behind the castle. Now, in the blue hour between dusk and dark, something moved there. A wolf. Massive, black as spilled ink, with eyes like molten silver. He wasn't hunting. He was pacing, slow and measured, along the garden path. His breathing was controlled but deep. Every muscle in his body carried tension, not the violence of the kill, but something else. Something like grief, like something in him was splitting open, and he needed to run it out before he broke. She should have left the window. She should have looked away. A sensible woman would have closed the curtains and gone back to her chapter on root preservation. Instead, she opened the garden door and stepped outside, because apparently her survival instincts had been irreparably damaged by the flour barrel incident and had never fully recovered. The wolf's head snapped toward her immediately. His body went still, all the careful pacing suspended. For a moment, she could see the full weight of him, the massive shoulders, the curve of jaw, the way a single paw could span the width of her hand. If he wanted to move, she had nowhere to go. She sat down on the stone bench at the garden's edge and waited. For a long time, the wolf didn't move. He stood at the garden's far end, watching her with eyes that held intelligence and something that looked like loneliness. The silver caught the light and threw it back, and she understood that this was as close as she would get to seeing into him, this moment when the animal was close enough to show itself, but far enough to stay safe. Then, very slowly, he lay down. Not aggressive, not a threat, just a choice to settle his weight on the stone. The wolf's nose twitched, rain scent, green scent, the not threat who sat without moving. Something in the animal settled further, a loosening that had nothing to do with thought and everything to do with the simple recognition of safety. The wolf closed his eyes. Ehrlich sat on the bench and read by the light of the emerging stars. She didn't speak, she didn't approach. She just occupied the space beside him, present but not demanding. And very gradually the wolf's breathing deepened. The tension in his shoulders eased. He wasn't sleeping, but he was close to it. That state where the body could finally rest because the mind had stopped fighting itself. After an hour, the moonlight changed. The wolf opened his eyes and rose, stretched with the elegant twist of a predator comfortable in his own skin. He approached her slowly, not menacing, but careful. She held still as he extended his nose and scented her. His breath was warm. She could smell the forest on his fur, and something underneath that. Copper and stone, and some wild thing she didn't have words for. For a moment, she thought he might shift back to human. The wolf seemed suspended between forms, caught between the two parts of Alaric's being. But then he simply turned and padded back into the darkness, back toward the castle's interior, leaving her alone in the garden with the wolfsbane and the stars, and the understanding that something fundamental had changed between them. Later, in human form, standing in his chamber with the shift still warm in his muscles, Alaric let the animal part of his mind surface its verdict. She's insane. Or brave. Can't tell. One of them smells good. We're going to be difficult about her. He pushed the thought down. It didn't stay down. It rarely did when the wolf had already made up its mind, which was inconvenient because the wolf's decision-making process appeared to be, she sat still and smelled like herbs, therefore she is ours. This was not the kind of strategic analysis that held up in a war council. He tried to explain to the wolf that geopolitical decisions should not be based on someone's scent profile. The wolf was unimpressed by this argument. Ehrlich understood, in that moment, that somewhere in the last 3 weeks, the performance had developed a layer underneath. That Alaric wasn't just using her to manipulate the court, and that she wasn't just using him to save her sisters. There was something else now, something without name or purpose, something that existed in the spaces between the lies. She gathered her book and went back inside. But she found herself thinking about what it meant to sit with someone in their raw form and not need them to be anything but what they were. That was the real magic, she thought. Not the potions, not the spells, just presence, just choosing, just the quiet willingness to see someone truly and not flinch away. The next morning, Alaric appeared in the corridor outside her chamber, wearing last night's boots and a shirt that didn't fit him. The sleeve stopped halfway down his forearms. The collar was wrong. Every seam looked like it was being held hostage. Ehrlich stared. "Don't," he said. "That's not your shirt." "My shirt didn't survive the garden." He said it flatly, the way a man discusses weather. Shifting destroys clothing. This is a known fact. This is Keth's shirt, and Keth is smaller than me. And if you say one more word about it, I will have you reassigned to the kitchens. She pressed her lips together. The shirt strained across his shoulders in a way that was, objectively, ridiculous. The alpha king of the realm, borrower of shirts, destroyer of wardrobes. She briefly imagined a royal decree. Let it be known that the king requires a clothing budget 3 times that of any normal man, on account of his inability to remain in one form for an entire evening. You could keep spare clothes in the garden, she offered. I could also not shift in the garden. That would be the dignified solution. He adjusted a sleeve that refused to stay adjusted. Unfortunately, Dignity and I had a disagreement 3 days ago, and haven't spoken since. I'm not laughing, Ehrlich said, though her mouth was doing something she couldn't quite control. You are absolutely laughing. I can smell it. Amusement has a smell, since you're curious. Yours smells like time and something annoyingly warm. He walked past her toward the stairs. Breakfast, and then we need to discuss your sister. The amusement left her instantly. What about my sister? He stopped, turned. The ill-fitting shirt suddenly didn't matter at all. Sabra, she's worse. The holding cell conditions. They moved the coven to a smaller chamber last week when the western tower flooded. Damper, colder. Her lungs. He studied her face. You already knew. I suspected. She's always had a weak chest. The cell air would... Airless stopped herself, made herself breathe. What do you know? My physician checked her this morning at my request. Lung fever, settling deep. He can treat wolves. His remedies are calibrated for their metabolism, their tolerance. For a human woman of her age, with her constitution, he says his dosages could kill her as easily as cure her. Alaric's voice was clinical, the way it got when he was holding something at arm's length. She needs a healer who understands human physiology, who knows the exact herbs, the exact amounts, the exact timing. She needs me. Yes. Airless waited for the negotiation, for the leverage, for the part where he reminded her that this was a bargain, that her cooperation had a price, that everything in this castle ran on transactions and debts and the careful balancing of power. She waited for the king. Instead, Alaric reached behind the door of the corridor storage and produced a leather satchel. He opened it on the stone ledge between them. Time. Fresh, not dried. Someone had ridden out before dawn to find it. Nettles, bundled carefully in damp cloth to preserve the sting. White horehound for the deep congestion. Mallow root, still carrying the scent of wet earth. Elderberry for the fever's grip. And at the bottom, wrapped separately in a clean linen square, fresh lungwort. The one herb that would make the difference. The one that didn't grow within 50 miles of the castle. Airless's hands stopped working. She stared at the satchel, at the precise selection, at the lungwort that someone had traveled hours to retrieve. How long has she been worse? She asked. Her voice came out wrong, too thin, too high. 2 days. I ordered the rider out the first evening. 2 days? You've known for 2 days and you didn't tell me? I wanted the herbs in hand before I told you. Telling you your sister was dying without the means to save her would have been... He paused, searching for the word. Cruel. And I've been many things to you, but I'm trying not to be that. Airlish reached for the lungwort with hands that trembled. She turned it in her fingers, feeling the familiar texture, the slightly sticky surface that meant it was fresh enough to work. The dosage calculations were already running through her mind. Sabra's weight, her age, the progression of the fever, the time she'd been untreated. I need boiling water, she said. Clean cloth. A private room where she won't be disturbed. And I need you to tell the guards that I'm to have unrestricted access to the holding cell until she's stable. Done. And I need... She stopped, looked at him. Really looked at him, the way she'd looked at the wolf in the garden. Not at the king, not at the man running a game. At whoever had sent a rider into the night for lungwort 2 days ago and said nothing about it. What? He asked. Nothing, thank you. He nodded once, already turning away, then paused. The lungwort was the difficult one. The rider said the nearest stand was in the high valleys past Greywater. He also said the terrain was, and I'm quoting, a nightmare dreamed by goats. I thought you'd want to know. A beat. That will be the last time I send a man up a mountain for herbs without asking you first, which mountain? She almost smiled. Almost. You could have asked me. I'd have told you where it grows. And deprive my rider of his new hatred of goat terrain? That seems cruel. The man has very specific feelings about cliffs now. I think he's writing a complaint. She did smile then, and for a moment, standing in a corridor with a satchel of herbs between them, and a sister dying 2 floors below, something passed between them that had nothing to do with performance. Just 2 people who understood that kindness didn't need to announce itself, even when one of them was wearing a shirt that belonged to someone 3 sizes smaller. She worked for 6 hours. The holding cell had been transformed by the time she arrived. Fresh bedding, dry air from braziers, warm water already heated. Someone had anticipated every need before she'd articulated it. Sabra lay on the cot, her breathing shallow and wet, her face gray with the effort of pulling air through flooded lungs. Earless brewed the tea with the precision of 20 years' practice. Lungwort steeped in boiling water for exactly 4 minutes, strained through clean cloth, mixed with honey for Sabra's throat and a measure of the white horehound for the congestion settling deep in her chest. She added thyme oil to a cloth and laid it across Sabra's upper chest, where the warmth and the vapor could work together. The other sisters watched in silence. Maren held Sabra's hand. The 7 others formed a half-circle of quiet vigilance, their fear visible in the way they held themselves, very still, barely breathing, as though making any sudden movement might tip the balance toward loss. "Drink," Earless murmured, lifting Sabra's head. "Small sips. Let it work." Sabra drank, coughed, drank again. The tea was bitter even with the honey, and Sabra's face twisted, but she swallowed because Earless told her to, and because 20 years of trust was stronger than the taste of medicine. By the 3rd hour, the fever had begun to ease. By the 5th, Sabra was breathing more deeply, the wet rattle in her lungs loosening. By the 6th hour, she was sleeping, actual sleep, not the restless half-consciousness of fever. Earless sat back on her heels. Her hands were stiff from measuring and mixing. Her back ached. The holding cell smelled of thyme and horehound and the clean mineral scent of fresh-cut lungwort. Maren knelt beside her. "Where did you get the herbs?" "The king sent them." Maren was quiet for a moment. "The bewitched king," she said carefully, "sent fresh lungwort that doesn't grow within 50 miles of this castle. 2 days before you even asked." Earless didn't answer. She didn't need to. Maren's sharp eyes saw everything. The quality of the herbs, the specificity of the selection, the fact that this was not the behavior of a man under enchantment. This was the behavior of a man paying attention, a man who had quietly done the right thing and hadn't made a performance of it. "The potion didn't work," Maren said. It wasn't a question. "Maren, don't. I won't say anything to the others, but I need you to know that I see it. Whatever is happening between you and the Alpha King, it's not magic. It's something else." She looked toward Sabra's sleeping form, something that sends riders for lungwort at midnight. Earless left the holding cell as the evening bells rang. She walked the corridor back to the royal wing, feeling hollowed out and filled up in equal measure. Something had cracked open in her chest. Not the manufactured certainty of the potion, not the desperate performance of the claimed consort, but something raw and specific and terrifying. The kind of feeling you couldn't brew in a vial, because it came from watching someone do the right thing when no one would have known if they hadn't. She found Alaric in his chambers. He looked up from the maps he was studying. Always maps, always strategy, always the next problem. "Sabra's fever broke," she said. He nodded once, then went back to his maps. That was all. No grand gesture, no claim of credit, no reminder that he held her sister's life in his hands. Just a nod, and the quiet understanding that he had done this because it was right, and it didn't require acknowledgement. Earless stood in the doorway and felt the last wall between performance and truth begin to crack. The assassination came on a morning in the 4th week. Earless had spent the past week reading everything Fenn, the records clerk, brought her. Patrol schedules, garrison reports, taxation records. Because a healer's instinct for diagnosis extended beyond bodies, systems got sick too. And something in this castle's systems was wrong in a way she couldn't quite name yet. Patrol routes had shifted. Supply requisitions from the eastern garrison had tripled. A land grant for a man named Henrik had been signed by Lucius 6 weeks ago. The same Henrik who captained the general's personal guard. She hadn't told Alaric yet. She wasn't sure what she'd found. She was still reading, still diagnosing, still looking for the shape of the illness underneath the symptoms. She was in the corridor near the courtyard, carrying a stack of Fenn's latest documents, when the world broke apart. The first crossbow bolt hit the wall 2 inches from Alaric's head. He'd been crossing the courtyard toward the stables, dressed for an early ride, and the bolt came from the battlements above, from inside the castle's own defenses. 6 men in unmarked armor dropped from positions along the wall, moving in coordinated formation, moving toward Alaric. This wasn't an assassination attempt on a witch. This was a decapitation strike on the king. Alaric moved with the reflexes of something that was only partly human. The second bolt missed because he was already in motion, spinning toward the nearest attacker with a speed that made the air blur. He hadn't shifted yet, still in his riding clothes, still human, still assessing. Then the third bolt caught him in the shoulder, and he shifted between heartbeats, the human form collapsing inward, the wolf exploding outward. Massive, black, pale silver eyes, wild with fury. The bolt's shaft snapped off in the shift, but the head was still in him. He moved like water with a wound, slower on the left side, compensating, lethal but compromised. 4 of the attackers went down in the first minute. The wolf was staggering now, blood matting the fur along his left flank, the bolt's iron point grinding against bone with every lunge. The 2 remaining assassins had clearly planned for this. They split apart, forcing the wounded wolf to choose a direction. The crossbowman on the battlements was reloading. From his angle, he had a clear shot at the wolf's exposed flank. Airlie could see the geometry of it, the bolt, the wolf, the distance that was too far for Alaric to close before the shot landed. She ran, not toward safety, not toward the castle interior, but across the courtyard at an angle that put her between the crossbowman and the wolf. She didn't have a weapon, she didn't have magic, not the kind that worked in a warded castle. She had her body, and the understanding that if the next bolt hit Alaric's flank, the iron would find his heart. The bolt hit her instead. It took her in the side, just below the ribs, and the world went very white, and then very red, and then very, very quiet. She heard herself make a sound that wasn't a scream, more like all the air leaving her body at once. She hit the cobblestones. The sky was very blue above her. She had the absurd thought that she should have stayed behind the flour barrel. The flour barrel had never hurt anyone. The wolf's howl split the courtyard in half. Not a howl of pain, not grief, not yet. Rage. The kind of sound that emptied the world of everything except itself. The remaining 2 attackers died in the space between that howl and the silence after. The crossbowman on the wall died trying to reload. He didn't finish. Airless lay on the cobblestones and watched the sky and thought about dosages. The bolt was in her right side, below the rib cage, which meant liver or kidney, or, if she was very lucky, the fleshy part that contained nothing critical. She couldn't tell. Her hands were trying to find the wound, and finding instead a bolt shaft and a spreading warmth that she knew, with the clinical detachment of a healer, was blood loss. This is what you get, she thought, for falling for a man you can't even properly poison. Also, ow. The wolf was beside her, enormous, panting, his own blood mixing with hers on the cobblestones. The silver eyes were wild with something she'd never seen in them before. Not the controlled assessment of a predator, not the amused calculation of a king. Terror. The wolf was terrified. He nosed at her wound, frantic, his massive head pushing against her hands as though he could somehow heal her by proximity. A whine escaped him, high and thin, a sound that did not belong to a creature that size. His body curled around hers, the huge frame forming a wall between her and the courtyard, and the whine became a sound she had no word for, the noise an animal makes when the thing it chose has broken and it doesn't know how to fix it. She laid her hand on his muzzle, blood on her fingers smeared across the black fur. The bolt didn't hit anything critical, she said, though she wasn't entirely sure about that. I need you to shift back. I need hands, not paws. Alaric. Shift. The wolf didn't move. The silver eyes stared at her with an expression that, in a human face, would have been the look of a man watching the world end. Alaric, she said again, firmer. I'm a healer, and I'm telling you to shift back and pull this bolt out of me before I have to do it myself, which I will, and I'll be very annoyed about it, and you'll hear about it for years. The shift was violent, graceless, none of the usual fluid transition. He went from wolf to man in a wrench of bone and muscle, and then he was kneeling beside her, naked and blood-covered and shaking so badly his hands could barely find the bolt. His sleeping clothes had been destroyed in the courtyard shift. His riding shirt was in pieces. He was, she noted with the part of her brain that was apparently immune to crisis, completely naked in a courtyard full of dead men and castle guards, and nobody was looking at him because they were all looking at her. Hold still, he said, and his voice cracked on the second word. I'm the healer here, she said. Grip the shaft close to the skin. Pull straight, don't angle it. Do you have clean cloth? You're giving me instructions on how to save your life while you're bleeding on my courtyard? Someone has to. You look like you're about to cry or kill someone, and either way, I'd prefer to not have a crossbow bolt in me while you decide. He pulled the bolt. She screamed, briefly, which she felt was justified. The wound bled freely, which was actually good. Clean, no dark blood, no organ smell. Liver and kidney were intact. She was going to live, assuming infection didn't set in, which meant she needed… Yarrow, she gasped. In my chamber, the satchel, second pocket. And clean linen. And Sabra, get Sabra. She knows wound treatment and she won't panic. Alaric shouted orders. Guards ran. Someone produced a cloak, which Alaric wrapped around his waist with the unself-conscious efficiency of a man who'd been naked after shifts more times than he could count. His hands were still shaking. There was blood on his face, hers, and he was staring at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the silver amusement of the feast hall, not the clinical control of the court. Something broken open, something that looked like the moment after you understand what you're about to lose. You ran in front of a crossbow bolt, he said. I did. For me. Well, it wasn't for him. She gestured vaguely toward the dead crossbowman on the wall, then winced because gesturing was a terrible idea. Ow, yes, for you. Because you had a bolt in your shoulder, and he was going to put the next one through your heart, and I have spent a month building a fake relationship with you, and I refuse to have it end because of substandard castle security. Airless. Also because I didn't want you to die. That's the other reason. The main one, actually, if we're being specific, which I think we should be, because I might pass out soon. He was holding her. She wasn't sure when that had started. His arms were around her, careful of the wound, and his face was pressed against her hair, and she could feel his heartbeat hammering against her shoulder. Too fast, too hard. The rhythm of a man who had just discovered something he didn't know how to say. The potion didn't work, he said into her hair. No. This isn't a potion. No. This is the other thing, the real thing. The thing I said couldn't happen to me. Apparently it can. Apparently it can. He pulled back enough to look at her, and his eyes were completely silver. The wolf right at the surface, and both of them, the man and the animal, were looking at her with the kind of raw, unmasked devotion that made her forget she had a hole in her side. Sabra arrived with the yarrow and clean linen, and the specific calm fury of a woman who'd been told her student had been shot with a crossbow and was going to have opinions about it. She dressed the wound with the efficiency of 30 years of practice, muttering about idiots who run toward projectiles, and then ordered Alaric, the Alpha King, the most powerful man in the kingdom, to carry Airless to her chamber and not jostle her, or she would personally make his life very difficult. Alaric carried Airless without argument. He also, at some point, acquired a shirt, though Earlise was too focused on not passing out to notice whose it was. She hoped it was Keth's again. Some traditions are worth maintaining. She woke in her chamber to find Alaric sitting in the chair beside her bed. He was dressed now, his own clothes this time, but he looked like he hadn't slept. The fire was low. The room smelled of yarrow and the beeswax candles that Fen kept bringing her. How long? She asked. A day. Sabra's checked on you 4 times. Marin has checked on you twice and reorganized your herb shelf both times, which I believe is her way of expressing concern. Earlise tried to sit up. The wound protested. She compromised by propping herself on one elbow and glaring at the pain until it became manageable. The attackers, she said. Dead, all of them. Who sent them? Alaric was quiet for a long time. Then, the scent on their armor, the steel of their weapons, forged in the eastern garrison. The patrol routes that were altered 3 days before the attack, clearing the battlements of my guards and replacing them with men who answered to someone else. His voice was perfectly level, which was somehow worse than if he'd been shouting. The same things you've been reading about in Fen's documents, I think. Lucius, Airlise said. Lucius, 23 years. The last person alive who understood the weight of running a kingdom. He stood and moved to the window. He wasn't trying to kill you. He was trying to kill me, and replace me with someone he could control. Someone who would agree that the witches should burn and the old ways should stay dead. The silence that followed was the sound of the world rearranging itself. He's still in the castle, Alaric said. In the eastern wing. He doesn't know the attack failed. I sealed the messenger routes. He's been sending servants to ask about the chaos in the courtyard. Concerned, helpful Lucius. Loyal Lucius. 23 years of trust, Lucius. He turned from the window. I'm going to challenge him. Challenge him? A dominance challenge, in the old way, wolf to wolf, in front of the pack. His voice was flat. He's an alpha. He tried to take the throne by treachery. The pack law is clear. If he won't submit, he dies in the challenge. If he submits, he dies anyway, because an alpha who plots to kill his king doesn't get to walk away. Alaric, he tried to kill me, and he almost killed you. Something cracked in the flatness of his voice, just for a moment. The bolt was meant for my heart. You stepped in front of it. You, a human woman with no armor and no magic in a warded castle. You ran across a courtyard and put your body between a crossbow bolt and a wolf who weighs 4 times what you do. He was staring at her. Why? I already told you why. Tell me again, without the jokes, without the deflection, without the part where you make it sound reasonable. Airless looked at him. The exhaustion in his face, the silver still burning in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders that said the wolf was right beneath the surface, waiting. Because I love you, she said. Not because of a potion, not because of a deal. Because you sent a rider for Lungmort and didn't tell me. Because you sat in a garden as a wolf and let me stay. Because you nod when something matters and you don't make it into a performance. Because you're wearing your own shirt today and I'm actually slightly disappointed. Because you are the most infuriating, complicated, terrifying man I have ever met. And I stepped in front of that bolt because the alternative was a world without you in it. And that world can burn. He crossed the room in 2 strides and kissed her, carefully because of the wound, but with the kind of intensity that suggested careful was costing him everything he had. When he pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, his breath uneven, the wolf was so close to the surface that his eyes were pure silver. I need to deal with Lucius, he said. I know. I need you to stay in this bed. Absolutely not. Airless, I have a crossbow wound, not a death wish. I'm going to watch. I am going to sit in a chair and watch, because the woman who stepped in front of a bolt for you has earned the right to see how this ends. He looked like he wanted to argue. The wolf looked like it agreed with her. This appeared to annoy him. Fine, he said, but if you open that wound, Sabra is going to kill both of us, and I want that on record. They brought her a chair. They put it at the edge of the courtyard, wrapped in furs, with Sabra on one side holding a bag of fresh bandages, and Marin on the other, holding a ledger she'd apparently been working on, because Marin processed stress through administrative efficiency. The pack had gathered in a wide circle. Wolves in human form, every alpha, every beta, the full hierarchy of Alaric's kingdom arranged around the edges of the courtyard stones. They knew why they were here. Pack law was old. Pack law was clear. Keth stood nearest to Alaric, his expression the flat mask of a soldier who'd already chosen his side. Lucius was brought from the eastern wing in armor. He walked with his shoulders straight, his eyes sweeping the courtyard with the tactical assessment of a man who'd survived 100 battles. When he saw Airless, alive, bandaged, sitting in a chair at the edge of the challenge ground, something shifted in his expression. Surprise. Then cold calculation. Then something like grief. Lucius, Alaric said. His voice carried across the stone. You are charged before the pack with conspiracy against your king, with plotting my death by hired blade, with the attempted murder of every person in this courtyard who stood between your assassins and my throne. The kingdom was dying, Lucius said. His voice was steady, but his jaw was tight. You were dying, not in body, but but in judgment. The witch clouded you, the magic twisted what you are. I did what any loyal general would do when his king could no longer see clearly. You tried to have me killed. I tried to save the kingdom, the crown, everything we built together for 23 years. Then defend it, Alaric said, in the old way, wolf to wolf, as pack law demands. The courtyard went very quiet. Lucius closed his eyes. When he opened them, whatever was left of the man who'd served his king for 23 years had been replaced by something harder, something that had already made peace with how this would end. So be it, Lucius said. Violent, simultaneous, the sound of two massive wolves emerging. They shifted at the same time. Alaric's transformation was the one she knew, the black wolf, enormous, silver-eyed. But he was wounded. The shoulder where the bolt had hit was stiff, the movement there compromised. He favored the left side, and every wolf in the courtyard could see it. Lucius's wolf was gray, massive in his own right, scarred from decades of battle. Slightly smaller than Alaric, but broader across the chest, with amber eyes that held the flat focus of a predator who had been killing things since before most of the pack had been born. He moved with the economy of a fighter who knew exactly how much energy each motion cost and refused to waste a single ounce. They circled. The courtyard was silent, except for the scrape of claws on stone and the deep, subsonic growling that Ehrlich felt in her chest more than heard. The black wolf moved carefully, testing the shoulder, gauging its limitations. The gray wolf watched, waited. He was patient. He'd always been patient. 23 years of patience. 23 years of watching and learning exactly how the king fought, exactly where his openings were, exactly when his left side dropped in a turn. Lucius struck first. A feint to Alaric's good side, then a devastating lunge toward the wounded shoulder. Fast, precise. The attack of a general who'd studied his king's weaknesses for 2 decades. The impact sent both wolves skidding across the cobblestones. Lucius's jaws found the wounded shoulder and clamped down. Alaric's howl split the night. Pain and fury tangled together, and he twisted with his full weight, tearing free at the cost of the wound ripping wider. Blood sprayed across the stones. The black wolf staggered. The gray wolf pressed the advantage, driving forward, going for the throat. Ehrlich gripped the arm of her chair. Beside her, Sabra's hand found hers and held. Marin had stopped pretending to work on her ledger. Alaric caught Lucius's lunge with his jaw, redirecting the gray wolf's momentum into the stone wall. The impact was enormous. Lucius yelped, a sound of genuine pain, and recovered, but slower. The black wolf circled, bleeding heavily from the shoulder, and something in the way he moved had changed. The stiffness was still there, the wound was real, but underneath it a decision had been made. Not the calculated patience of a king, the absolute stillness that came before a wolf committed everything. She saw the wolf's eyes find her across the courtyard. Just for a moment, silver on silver, locked on the woman in the chair with the bandaged side and the white-knuckled grip. Something passed between them that had nothing to do with words. Explosive, devastating, the sound of a wolf committed to ending it. The black wolf lunged, not at Lucius's flank, not at his legs, not at any of the tactical targets a careful fighter would choose. Straight at the throat, full commitment, no retreat. The gray wolf met him head-on, jaws snapping for the same target, and for a moment the two animals were locked together, teeth and muscle, and 23 years of trust and betrayal tearing at each other in the moonlight. Then Alaric's jaws found their mark. The black wolf's teeth closed around Lucius's throat with the precision of something that had been bred for this across 1,000 generations, and he bore the gray wolf down to the cobblestones with the full force of his weight. The courtyard holds its breath. Then, a long, slow exhale from the fallen wolf. Lucius didn't struggle. The gray wolf lay on the stones with the black wolf's jaws at his throat, and something in the amber eyes shifted. The fight going out of them, the way a candle gutters when the wick is spent. He could have thrashed. He could have fought to the end. Instead, he lay still, and the stillness was its own kind of answer. 23 years of loyalty, twisted into something monstrous, and at the end, the wolf knew what the man had refused to accept. It was over. Alaric held the grip for a long time. The courtyard was silent. The pack watched. And then the black wolf's jaws tightened, once, with finality, and the gray wolf's amber eyes went dark. Not triumph, not rage. Something between grief and ending. The black wolf released the body and lifted his head and howled. Not a victory cry. Not the sound of a king who'd won. The sound of a man who'd just killed the closest thing he'd had to a brother, and who would carry the weight of it for the rest of his very long life. The pack answered. One by one, the wolves in the courtyard tilted their heads back and joined the howl, until the night was full of it. A wall of sound that was grief and acknowledgement, and the terrible clarity of pack law fulfilled. They howled for the general who'd served them. They howled for the betrayal that had ended him. They howled because howling was the only honest thing left to do. Ehrlich sat in her chair with tears on her face, and her wound aching, and Sabra's hand in hers. And she understood that she was watching the cost of everything she'd set in motion the day she'd corked a vial and decided to gamble. He came to her chamber hours later, after the body had been carried away, after the pack had dispersed, after the castle had settled into the particular silence that followed violence. He was in human form, dressed in clean clothes, but she could see the night on him, in the hollows of his eyes, in the way he moved like something that had been taken apart and put back together wrong. The wound on his shoulder had been dressed by the physician. The wound inside him had not. He sat on the edge of her bed without speaking. She didn't ask him to talk. She just shifted, carefully, because the crossbow wound made everything careful, until she could reach his hand. He let her take it. His fingers were cold. They sat like that for a long time. The fire crackled, the castle breathed around them. Somewhere in the eastern wing, Lucius's quarters were being cleared by servants who didn't know what to say, and so said nothing. "I keep thinking," Alaric said finally, his voice rough, "that he was right about one thing. Not about killing me, not about the conspiracy, but about you changing me. He saw it before I did, that I was becoming someone different because you were there, and he couldn't accept that the different version might be better. Was he wrong about the changing? No." He looked at her. The silver was muted now, exhaustion dulling it. "I am different. I was a king who signed execution orders because my advisors said to, who let women burn because it was easier than questioning the premise, who walked through a kingdom and never once asked whether the machine I'd built was worth the fuel it consumed. And then a witch, with a terrible potion and very good cheekbones, sat in my garden and read a book, and I became someone who sends riders for lungwort. My cheekbones are only slightly above average. They are extraordinary, and you know it. Don't fish for compliments while I'm having an emotional crisis." She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Yes? I haven't asked it yet." "I know, but the answer is yes." He pulled back to look at her. "You don't know what I'm going to ask. You're going to ask about the marking, the mate bond, whether I want it to be real, now that the pretending is over and the general is dead and the kingdom is watching and everything is different. How did you? Because I'm a healer, and I've been reading your symptoms for a month." She reached up and touched his face, and the wolf surfaced in his eyes at the contact, silver flooding the gray. "Yes, I want the bond. I want the marking. I want it to go both ways. I mark you, you mark me. The witch claims the Alpha King, not just the other way around." Something flared in his expression, surprise, and then something deeper, something that looked like the wolf and the man arriving at the same conclusion for the first time in weeks. He tilted his head, bared his throat. The Alpha King, who had never submitted to anyone, offering his neck to a witch with a crossbow wound and a history of terrible potions. She bit down first, not gently, not with hesitation. the way a woman claims what she has decided is hers. His breath caught. A sharp intake, not pain exactly, but the shock of being chosen by someone who could have walked away. The bond opened between them like a door she hadn't known was there. Not magic, not the artificial pull of a potion, something older. Something that had been building since a flour barrel and a failed recipe and a king who'd smiled and said, "Congratulations, you saved yourself by failing completely." Then he turned to her neck, careful of the wound at her side, and his teeth found the place where her shoulder curved up into the column of her throat. The marking was precise, a bite that was a question and an answer and a claim, all at once. She gasped. Pain and warmth, and the sudden overwhelming sensation of the bond completing from both sides, meeting in the middle, locking into place with the finality of something that would not come undone. "You're mine now," he said, "and I'm yours," which, for the record, has never happened to an Alpha King before. So congratulations on yet another historical first, achieved through sheer, unrelenting audacity. I believe the technical term is reckless charm. The technical term is you ran in front of a crossbow bolt in a nightgown. We're going to have a conversation about that. Later, much later, he agreed, and kissed her again, and the mate bond hummed between them like a string that had finally been tuned to the right note. In the back of his mind, the wolf offered its assessment of the evening. She bit us first. This is either a very good sign or a very bad sign. Either way, we're keeping her. File under non-negotiable. In the days that followed, the court had to be managed. Earlys moved through it, slowly, because the crossbow wound was the kind of injury that made even walking feel like an opinion, with the understanding that every eye was watching. She was still the witch. Still the woman who had supposedly seduced the Alpha King with love magic. But now there was something else in the narrative. The fact that she had stepped in front of a crossbow bolt meant for his heart, and the mutual marking on both their necks that made it clear this was not enchantment. This was a choice, made by both of them, in blood. The court found it terrifying and romantic in roughly equal measure, which Earlys considered the ideal ratio. Sabra was brought to better quarters. The other sisters were released from the holding cell and given work in the castle. Marin became a scribe, the fastest route to accessing every document in the building, which Earlys suspected was Marin's way of running her own diagnostic on the kingdom's systems. 3 of the others joined the kitchens. 2 went to the library. 1, to everyone's surprise, befriended Keth's pack and started running with them on the dawn circuits, which Keth reported to Alaric with the expression of a man who didn't know how he felt about it and wasn't going to examine the question further. Within the week, Earlys found herself in the library with Marin. The younger witch was cataloging texts, her sharp eyes moving across titles with the precision of someone trained in knowledge and order. "I told the others," Marin said without looking up from her work. Earlys went still. "About the potion. About the potion, about the lie, about the fact that your Alpha King isn't bewitched and never was." Marin finally looked up. Her eyes were harder than they'd been. "They deserved the truth. I gave you time to tell them yourself. You didn't. I was going to, when? After the marking. After the crossbow bolt. After the wolf duel." Marin's voice was steady, precise. Sabra cried. "Not because you lied, she understands why. Because you didn't trust her enough to stop. Anouk hasn't spoken to anyone since. The others are processing." Earlys felt the words land like stones. "He could still hurt you," Marin said. "Yes," Earlys said. "He could. And you chose him anyway. And then you stepped in front of a crossbow bolt for him, which is either the bravest or the most idiotic thing I've ever heard, and I've read a lot of history. I chose the truth of him, not the safety of him. Those aren't the same thing." Marin turned back to her books. "Sabra will forgive you. She forgives everything. But some of the others will hold the lie against you for a long time. They'll think you sacrificed truth to survive, and they'll be right. You can't unsay that." "I know," Earlys said. "Good," Marin said. "Then we know where we stand, which is better than a lie, even a necessary one." She paused. Then, very quietly, "Also, the filing system in this castle is atrocious. I've reorganized 3 departments already, and I think the Master of Coin is afraid of me. The Treasury records appear to have been maintained by someone whose primary qualification was optimism. I'm going to fix it. This is not a request. Marin. I'm just saying, if you're going to be the Alpha King's witch, someone should make sure the kingdom's records aren't held together with hope and string. You handle the romance and the crossbow wounds. I'll handle the infrastructure. Division of labor. On the night of the full moon, Alaric took her to the courtyard outside the castle. She walked beside him under her own power, though slowly, and with Sabra's voice in her head, reminding her that if she tore her stitches, she'd be re-sewn without the numbing herbs, and that was a promise, not a threat. The stones were silver with light. The pack had gathered, the alphas and the younger wolves, all in their human forms. They were waiting. The space where Lucius would have stood was empty, and no one pretended it wasn't. Your sisters are free now, Alaric said. The order has been issued. The kingdom knows that magic is not a threat, that healing is not corruption, that the old ways are worth preserving. Airless understood what he wasn't saying, that this had cost him, that Lucius's death was a wound that would never fully heal, that the other alphas were watching to see if the king's judgment was sound or if he'd made a terrible mistake. Are you afraid? She asked. Terrified, he said. That we're starting something that can't be stopped. That I've opened a door that will eventually swallow the kingdom. That your sisters will learn magic from the old places and decide that you don't need me anymore. He paused. That you'll realize you could have survived without the marking, without the claim, without the mate bond, without the extremely dramatic crossbow incident. The crossbow incident wasn't dramatic. It was practical. You were about to die. You were wearing a nightgown. It was a very sturdy nightgown. What does your wolf think? Airless asked. That you're trouble. That you're going to cause political nightmares. That he's never been happier in his existence. A beat. He also thinks the filing reorganization your sister is doing to the Treasury records constitutes a hostile takeover, but he's been overruled. Marin is apparently scarier than pack law. Keth agrees. Alaric ran his fingers along the marks on her neck, where the mating was settling into the landscape of her skin. He touched his own mark, her bite, with the kind of absent wonder that suggested he still wasn't entirely sure how it had got there. We'll figure out the rest, he said. The kingdom, your coven, what happens when magic returns to a land that burned its practitioners. But tonight, I need you to understand something. What? She asked. That the Alpha King's witch is not a title. It's not a role. It's a fact now. Whether you want it or not, whether it's safe or not, whether your coven forgives you or not. The wolf knows you. The wolf chose you. The wolf never chooses wrong. The wolf chose me because I sat still and smelled like herbs. The wolf chose you because you sat in a garden with a predator and read a book, and then you ran in front of a crossbow bolt in a nightgown, and then you bit me first during the marking like that was a perfectly normal thing to do. That's either insane or brave, and the wolf has decided it doesn't care which. It has also decided that you smell like time and home, and it would like you to stop getting shot, please, because its heart can't take it. The pack shifted then, not all at once, but starting with the alphas. The human forms collapsed inward, the wolves expanding outward, until the courtyard was full of massive bodies and silver fur. It was a display of power and of trust, the pack showing itself to the witch without fear. Alaric was the last to shift. The transformation was beautiful and terrible, the human king collapsing into something far more primal, the wolf rising up in his place. He was enormous, black as the space between stars, with eyes that remained the pale silver of the man underneath. His shoulder bore the scar of the crossbow bolt. He would carry it forever. He approached her slowly. She held still. The massive head lowered until his nose was level with her chest, and he scented her, his mate, his chosen, the woman who smelled like time and bad decisions, and the kind of courage that had no business existing in someone who couldn't even shapeshift. His breath was warm against her skin. The silver eyes held no language, no thought she could read as words. But the meaning was unmistakable in the way his body settled, the way the tension left his shoulders, the way the enormous wolf simply exhaled against her and was still. Mine. Not as a word, as a fact, as the only fact that mattered. The pack began to run then, out through the castle gates and into the night. Alaric stayed behind long enough for her to see the human flicker across his eyes, the acknowledgement that he was still there underneath the animal, and that he was coming back, and that he would always come back. Then he turned and followed, his massive form disappearing into the darkness. Airlie stood in the silver moonlight with a crossbow wound and a mate bond and a coven that was furious with her and a kingdom that didn't know what to do with her. And she understood that the performance had finally ended. She was no longer the witch who'd attempted a love potion. She was the woman who'd survived it by failing, who'd chosen the truth over the safety of the lie, who'd run across a courtyard in a nightgown because the alternative was unacceptable, who'd learned that the most dangerous magic wasn't something you could mix in a vial. It was the kind that lived in choices, in presence, in the moment when you stopped being afraid of what someone could take from you and started trusting what they might give. The full moon rose over the kingdom, and for the first time in 5 generations, magic was not a threat to be burned. It was a promise to be kept.